A wealthy man discovered an abandoned infant on his doorstep one night. Years down the line, a Ferrari surprise rolled up to his estate, and a sharply dressed gentleman rang the doorbell. Paul Anderson, a billionaire renowned for his unyielding dedication to his business and his precise control over every detail of his life, returned to his mansion after a long, exhausting day of meetings. It was a peaceful evening, the kind he often longed for after intense days filled with high-stakes deals. His sleek, luxury car coasted effortlessly up the driveway, the gates of his vast estate closing behind him. Everything was as it always was, orderly, predictable, and perfectly under control. But tonight, something felt different. As he exited the car and made his way toward the grand entrance, a faint sound reached his ears. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a soft whimper, like a distant cry. Paul stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the neatly manicured grounds of his estate. The wind stirred the leaves in the trees, but that wasn't it. Then the sound came again, more distinct this time, the unmistakable cry of a baby. His pulse quickened. This didn't make any sense. No one ever arrived at his property without an invitation, and certainly not with an infant. He moved swiftly now, his expensive shoes tapping against the stone steps as he approached the front porch. And there, nestled in a bundle of blankets, was the source of the sound. A newborn baby, tiny and fragile, wriggling slightly. Its cries had quieted, but were still there, soft, yet insistent. Beside the baby was a folded note, its edges slightly yellowed, as if it had been hurriedly tucked beneath the blanket. Paul stood frozen for a moment, staring at the child. A baby, left here, on his doorstep. Almost in a daze, he kneeled down and picked up the letter. His hands, usually steady after years of making high-pressure decisions, shook slightly as he opened it. The handwriting was hurried, but readable. Please take care of my child. I cannot give them what they need. You can give them the life I never could. Please, Paul, I'm begging you. Protect my baby. The message was short, but it struck Paul hard, like a blow he wasn't prepared for. He was all too familiar with the feeling of being left behind. Old memories, the ones he thought he'd buried for good, began to creep back in. Memories of his rough childhood. Growing up without a father, constantly bounced around from one distant relative to another. No one had the time or patience for a curious little boy who asked too many questions. Paul's eyes shifted from the letter to the tiny baby that had finally stopped crying and now lay quietly, its small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. For a moment, he just stood there, torn between the logical thing to do, calling the police or social services, and something else, something deeper. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. A connection. After hesitating, he gently picked up the baby. It felt lighter than he expected, delicate in a way that stirred something inside him he couldn't quite place. He had built a fortune and ruled over entire industries. Yet holding this fragile child made him feel powerless. Paul stood at the entrance of his massive home, the grandeur around him clashing with the vulnerability he suddenly felt. For years, this house had been a testament to his success, a fortress where he kept the world at a distance. But now, with a baby in his arms, everything felt different. The quiet of the mansion no longer felt peaceful. It felt empty, almost haunting. He looked down at the baby's now peaceful face, and something shifted within him. He'd always prided himself on being in control of every detail of his life. But this was beyond anything he could manage. He knew the sensible thing to do was to call the authorities and let them take over. But for reasons he couldn't fully understand, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Paul walked back inside, holding the baby close as he moved through the grand entryway. He glanced up at the enormous chandelier, its light bouncing off the gleaming marble floor. This house had always been a symbol of his triumphs, the proof of his hard work and determination. But now, it just felt cold and lifeless. As he walked into the living room, a wave of doubt hit him. He didn't have a clue how to care for a baby. His life had always been about control, about being the best at everything. But here, standing in his mansion holding a newborn, Paul had never felt so unsure. That night, as the quiet hum of the city outside faded into the distance, Paul Anderson faced a decision unlike any he had ever encountered before. He could easily pick up the phone, call anyone, and free himself from this responsibility. Yet, something deep inside told him that this baby wasn't just a problem to hand off. Maybe, just maybe, this was the second chance he hadn't realized he was looking for. The sun had just started to rise, bathing Paul's grand estate in a soft golden glow, but sleep had completely escaped him. The baby's tiny whimpers and cries, which he had, in a split-second decision, named Eric, had kept him awake all night. His once peaceful mansion, known for its immaculate order, now felt like a storm of chaos, a beautiful yet overwhelming chaos brought by Eric. Standing in his oversized kitchen, Paul blankly stared at the baby bottle in his hand. For the last hour, he had wrestled with the task of preparing formula, desperately searching online for the right instructions. The irony struck him. He could close multi-million-dollar deals with ease, yet here he was, completely out of his depth, trying to make a bottle for a baby. With Eric cradled in one arm, he clumsily held the bottle in the other, exhaustion bearing down on him. The baby's tiny, scrunched-up face showed his hunger and frustration, but once he latched onto the bottle and began drinking, Paul felt a wave of relief wash over him as the crying ceased. Still, it wasn't just the physical fatigue that wore on him. It was the emotional weight of the decision he'd made the night before. A decision that felt unreal. He had chosen to keep Eric. For the first time in his life, Paul Anderson was responsible for someone other than himself. Earlier that morning, he had sat in his study, the same room where he had handled countless business deals, and stared at his phone, wrestling with the thought of making a call he knew he should. He had even dialed the number for child services, but had hung up at the last second. Something had stopped him. Something deep within whispered that Eric wasn't just a problem to be fixed. Eric was his opportunity to mend something broken within himself. The sharp sound of heels clicking against the marble floor distracted him from his thoughts. Charlotte, his assistant of nearly 10 years, entered the kitchen. A woman in her early 40s, she was all business, always composed. But when her eyes landed on the baby in Paul's arms, her usually calm demeanor faltered. She stood there, blinking, trying to make sense of the scene before her. Her powerful, organized boss holding a baby as if it didn't quite fit into the puzzle of his life. "Paul," she began, her voice steady, though laced with surprise. "Is that a baby?" Paul nodded slightly. "His name's Eric. Someone left him on my doorstep last night." Charlotte's eyes widened, though she quickly regained her composure. "And you're keeping him?" "I'm not sure yet," Paul replied, shifting uncomfortably. "But for now, yes. There was a letter. The mother, whoever she is, wants me to take care of him." Charlotte's expression softened as she moved closer, looking down at Eric, who was now dozing in Paul's arms, his tiny fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "Paul, you can't do this by yourself," she said gently. "Running a company and raising a baby is too much." "I know." His voice was tense, but not with her. "But I can't just give him up. Not yet. There's something about him." It feels like he's supposed to be here." Charlotte's face softened even more, though her practical side took over. "All right," she said, her tone decisive. "We need to get things sorted. I'll take care of a crib, baby supplies, and all the essentials you'll need to make this work, at least for now." Paul nodded slowly, gratitude in his eyes. Charlotte had always been his go-to, and now she was stepping up in a way he hadn't even realized he needed. As she started making phone calls, Paul walked over to the living room, gently lowering himself into one of the plush armchairs by the window. The morning sunlight filtered in, filling the room with a warm glow as he looked down at Eric, now peacefully asleep in his arms. In that quiet moment, Paul's mind wandered. Could he really do this? A man who had always been so sharp, so focused on the cutthroat world of business. Was he really capable of being a father to this tiny, vulnerable baby? But as the minutes passed, and Eric's small chest rose and fell with each breath, Paul realized something. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel alone. The emptiness that had filled his mansion and his life, for so long, seemed a little less overwhelming. Charlotte's voice drifted in from the kitchen as she arranged for a crib, the sound reassuring. Paul leaned back, still cradling Eric, and began to think about what all this could mean for his future. A man who always had every detail planned, every contingency mapped out, now faced with Eric, a mystery. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what Paul needed. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind of changes. In what seemed like no time at all, Charlotte had transformed Paul's sprawling mansion, converting a room into a nursery stocked with everything a baby could need. As Paul watched, his once quiet and guarded home slowly morphed into something warmer, more alive. He felt completely out of his element, as if he didn't belong in this new version of his life. But there was no choice. He had to adjust. One late evening, after yet another exhausting day of juggling conference calls and tending to Eric, Paul found himself standing in the nursery, gazing at the baby sleeping soundly in the crib. His phone buzzed with a message from a business associate, but for the first time, Paul didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he stayed still, staring at the little boy who had, in just a few days, turned his world upside down. Memories of his own childhood flooded his mind, being shuffled between relatives, never really finding a place to belong. He had sworn to himself early on that he would create a life so strong, so untouchable, that no one could ever cause him pain again. But now, here he was, feeling vulnerable in a way he never expected, responsible for someone he couldn't fully understand or control. As he watched Eric sleep, Paul made a silent promise. He didn't know where this road would take him, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to give up on this baby. Eric had ended up on his doorstep for a reason, and whether it was fate or just a twist of life, Paul didn't care. Eric was staying, and for the first time in his life, Paul was going to learn how to care for someone other than himself. 5 years passed, and Paul Anderson's world had changed in ways he never could have predicted. The carefully curated, orderly life he had built around his business had given way to something far more chaotic, but also more rewarding than he could have ever imagined. Eric, the baby left at his door that unforgettable night, had grown into a vibrant 5-year-old, full of curiosity and life. His energy filled the once quiet mansion with laughter and noise. Paul, who had once prided himself on keeping his emotions at bay, now couldn't picture life without Eric. But balancing the demands of fatherhood with the responsibilities of running a billion-dollar empire was no easy task. Paul had worked tirelessly to create a balance between his role at Anderson Enterprises and the responsibilities of being a single dad. Eric's days were packed with school, play dates, and endless curiosity about the world. Important meetings, business negotiations, and company growth were taking up Paul's time in the meantime. But this particular morning was different. He sat at his large wooden desk in his home office, going over the final details of a merger that had been months in the works. The glow from his laptop screen and the flood of emails felt like a return to the life he used to navigate with ease. However, the sound of Eric's voice coming from the playroom down the hall repeatedly disrupted his focus today. "Dad! Charlotte! Come see what I made!" Eric called out, his voice filled with pride. Paul checked the clock. He had 15 minutes before his next meeting. He could hear Charlotte, his dedicated assistant, doing her best to manage Eric's excitement with her usual calmness. Despite the looming work commitments, a smile tugged at Paul's lips. He stood up and walked down the hallway to the playroom. There, Eric was standing proudly beside a complex Lego structure, waving his little hands in excitement. "Look, Dad, it's a rocket ship, like the one we saw on TV last night," Eric said with a grin. Paul kneeled down to admire the creation, momentarily shedding his corporate persona as he took in his son's handiwork. "That's awesome, Eric," Paul said, ruffling his son's hair. "You're really turning into an engineer." Eric's face lit up, and Paul felt that familiar warmth spreading in his chest. The same warmth that had slowly replaced the detachment he once lived with. For a brief moment, work felt distant, like it belonged to a different life. But then Charlotte appeared in the doorway, a slight worry in her expression. "Paul, there's someone at the gate. You might want to check this out." Paul stood, his face slipping back into the composed look of a CEO. "Who is it?" he asked as he started toward the front of the house. "I'm not sure," Charlotte replied, keeping her voice calm but uncertain. "He's driving a red Ferrari, and he says it's urgent." "A Ferrari?" Paul raised an eyebrow as he headed to the entryway. He had handled his share of unexpected visitors over the years, but this felt different. He glanced back at Eric, still engrossed in his Lego rocket, and then turned to Charlotte. "Stay with Eric, I'll handle this." As Paul made his way to the front door, his eyes landed on a bright red Ferrari, idling just outside the gate. A man in an impeccably tailored suit stood next to the car, radiating a confidence that immediately made Paul tense. This wasn't a casual visit. Paul hit the button to open the gate, and the man walked in with a clear sense of purpose. His movements were calm and controlled. It was the kind of confidence that came from dealing with high-pressure situations. Paul had seen this demeanor before, in business meetings. This man was used to getting his way. The man reached the front steps and offered his hand as Paul opened the door. "Mr. Anderson, I'm David Howard. I represent someone who needs to speak with you about a very serious matter." Paul shook his hand, but kept his guard up. "I don't take meetings at home, Mr. Howard. Whatever this is, you'll need to go through my office." Howard gave a cold, thin smile. "I think you'll want to hear this, Mr. Anderson. It's about Eric." At the mention of Eric's name, Paul's whole body tensed. His thoughts raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Who was this man? And how did he know Eric? "I don't know what you're talking about," Paul replied, his voice steady. Howard reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, holding it out toward Paul. "I'm afraid you do, Mr. Anderson. Eric's biological mother has resurfaced, and she wants to reconnect. This letter will explain everything." Paul felt a chill as he took the envelope. For years, he had wondered about Eric's mother, the woman who left her baby on his doorstep with a desperate note asking for help. She had never reached out and never tried to get in touch. Paul had assumed she couldn't or wouldn't take care of Eric, and if he was honest, her absence had been a relief. But now, standing at his door, this stranger was threatening everything Paul had built with Eric, the life he had worked tirelessly to create. Paul ripped open the envelope, his hands shaking, and quickly scanned the letter inside. His eyes widened with shock as he took in the words. Anger and fear swirled together in his chest. The letter was from Eric's biological mother. She was alive, and she wanted to see her son. According to the letter, she had been searching for him for years, and now she had the money and legal standing to fight Paul for custody if he didn't cooperate. Paul's heart raced as he held the letter, struggling to comprehend what he was reading. He looked up at Howard, who stood there, calm and unreadable. "What does she want?" Paul asked, his voice low and threatening. Howard didn't blink. "She wants a chance to be a part of Eric's life. But if you refuse, she's ready to take you to court. She has strong connections, Mr. Anderson, and she's not going to back down." Paul's mind was spinning. His instincts screamed at him to protect Eric, to shield him from this unexpected danger. But he knew this wasn't something he could just push aside. Somewhere deep down, he had always feared this day might come. And now that it was here, he had no choice but to confront it. "I'll need time," Paul said, his voice barely containing his rage. "Tell her I'll get in touch. But let's be clear. Eric is my son. No one is taking him from me." Howard gave a slight nod, his face unreadable. "I'll let her know. But be prepared, Mr. Anderson. This won't be simple." With that, Howard turned and walked back to his car. Paul stood in the doorway, his fists clenched at his sides. The red Ferrari roared to life and sped down the driveway, disappearing through the gates. Paul stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the empty road. The weight of the letter hung heavy on his mind. Eric's mother was back, and nothing would be the same. Since David Howard's visit, the atmosphere in Paul Anderson's mansion has shifted dramatically. The well-ordered life Paul had carefully built was beginning to fall apart, faster than he could manage. For 5 years, he has raised Eric like his own, loved him, and created a world around him. But now, everything was at risk. Out of nowhere, the specter of Eric's birth mother threatened to unravel everything Paul had worked so hard to build. He sat alone in his study, the letter still lying open on his desk. He'd read it countless times, but the words were already seared into his mind. She's back. And she wants Eric. For days, Paul had been consumed with anxiety. Every time Eric darted down the hall, carefree laughter echoing through the house, Paul's heart tightened with fear. How could he possibly break it to his son that their world might be flipped upside down? How could he explain that the woman who once left him behind now wanted back into his life? The door creaked, and Charlotte quietly entered the room. Her expression was composed, but her eyes showed the worry she'd been trying to hide. She had stood by Paul's side from the beginning, helping him navigate fatherhood when he felt completely lost. She had seen him grow from a distant, work-focused man into a devoted, loving dad. And she knew this news was shaking him to his core. "You're not yourself, Paul," she said softly, stepping closer. "What's going on?" Paul exhaled deeply and rubbed his temples. "Eric's birth mom is back," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "She's got a lawyer, and she wants to meet him." Charlotte's face stayed neutral, though the worry in her eyes deepened. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Paul admitted, leaning back in his chair. "Every part of me wants to fight this. I don't want her anywhere near Eric. But what if she has a legal right? What if she can take him from me?" Charlotte sat down across from him, her hands resting in her lap. She was usually the voice of reason in his life, but even now, she paused before speaking. "Paul, you have to think about what's best for Eric. This isn't just about you." "I know," Paul said, his voice faltering. For the first time, Charlotte saw the raw fear in his eyes. He wasn't just upset. He was scared. "But what if letting her in hurts him?" he continued. "I don't know who she is. She left him once. She could do it again. She might have money, influence. But what kind of mother walks out on her child like that?" Charlotte leaned in, her tone soft but firm. "You've been an incredible dad to Eric, Paul. But this isn't about holding on to the way things are just because it's more comfortable. Eric has a right to know the truth about his origins, and you have a right to understand who this woman really is. Maybe, just maybe, she's not the villain you've built her up to be." Paul tightened his fists, his thoughts racing. He'd always prided himself on making smart, strategic decisions, the kind that drove his business and personal life forward. But this was different. It was messy, emotional, and completely out of his control. The idea of sharing Eric, especially with the woman who had walked away from them both, felt like losing everything he held dear. But Charlotte had a point. This wasn't just about him. It was about Eric and what would ultimately be best for his future. "I need to know what her intentions are," Paul muttered. "She claims she wants to be in Eric's life, but why now? Why after all this time?" Charlotte offered a solution. "I can set up a meeting with her somewhere neutral. You can listen to her without committing to anything." Paul paused, his mind running through all the potential outcomes. Could he really sit face to face with the woman who had destroyed his life, hear her out, and stay calm? But deep down, he knew there was no avoiding it. He couldn't ignore her existence, and he couldn't afford to let the situation spiral out of control. "Set it up," he finally agreed, his voice stern. "But it's going to happen on my terms." A few days later, Paul found himself sitting on a quiet park bench, his nerves worn thin. The spot was secluded, far from the press or anyone who might recognize him. His legal team had set strict guidelines for the meeting, and Paul had insisted that Eric wouldn't be there, at least not yet. The sound of footsteps made him look up. There she was, Linda, Eric's birth mother. She wasn't what he had pictured at all. She was dressed simply but tastefully, her face a mix of uncertainty and hope. She approached Paul carefully, her steps slow, hesitant. When she reached him, she managed a small, unsure smile. "Paul," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly, as if she had practiced this moment over and over. Paul stood, his jaw clenched. "Linda, I presume?" She nodded, her eyes flickering with nerves before landing back on his. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Paul didn't respond right away. Instead, he motioned toward the bench, and they both took a seat. The air between them was thick with tension. "I don't have much time," Paul said coolly, his words sharp. "So let's cut to the chase. Why now? Why after all these years?" Linda glanced down at her hands, her fingers anxiously twisting together. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, Paul. I left Eric on your doorstep, and I've lived with that choice every day since. But back then, my life was a mess. I didn't have the means or the stability. I thought, no, I knew you could give him the life I couldn't." Paul's eyes narrowed, barely containing the anger that was simmering just below the surface. "You thought you could just dump him on my doorstep and disappear. And now, you want to waltz back into his life like it never happened." Linda's expression tightened, and she nodded, absorbing the sting of his words. "I know it sounds selfish, but I've changed. I've built a stable life. I'm not the same person who left Eric with you. I just want to be part of his life, Paul. I'm not here to take him away from you, I swear. I just want to know him." Paul felt his throat constrict. He had braced himself for anger, a legal fight, a bitter struggle over control. But instead, Linda was sitting in front of him, pleading. Not for custody, not to take Eric, but for the chance to know the boy she had once abandoned. It complicated things in a way he hadn't expected. He leaned forward, his tone low and menacing. If I let you back into Eric's life, there will be no confusion. He's my son. I raised him. You don't get to swoop in and change that. Linda nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I understand, Paul. I'm not trying to replace you. I just want to be there for him, however you see fit. Paul leaned back, his mind spinning. He had anticipated this meeting ending in a showdown. But instead, he was sitting across from a woman who was shattered, asking for something much harder to refuse. I need time to think, Paul finally said, his voice flat. Eric doesn't know about you, and I won't let anyone turn his world upside down. But if I agree to this, it'll be on my terms. Linda wiped a tear from her face and nodded with gratitude. I really appreciate everything you've done for Eric, Paul, came the heartfelt thanks. Paul, feeling a storm of emotions welling up inside, offered a quick nod before walking away. His heart felt impossibly heavy as he wrestled with the decision now looming over him. That night, sitting quietly in Eric's room, Paul watched the boy sleep peacefully, completely unaware of what was happening. Eric didn't have the faintest idea that his whole world could be flipped upside down by someone he'd never met. And for the first time, Paul wasn't sure how to shield him from the emotional hurricane headed their way. His eyes fell on the letter from Linda, neatly folded on his desk. Every instinct in Paul screamed to protect Eric, to keep him wrapped in the safe bubble of the life Paul had worked so hard to build for them. But another part of him, a softer side that had grown since Eric became his responsibility, whispered that maybe, just maybe, letting Linda in wouldn't be the end of their world. Maybe it would even make them stronger. Paul stood, quietly closing the door behind him. One thing was clear in his mind. No matter what came next, he would do everything in his power to protect Eric's happiness. The real battle was just beginning. On a cool Saturday morning, Paul finally made up his mind. After a restless night replaying his conversation with Linda over and over, he was worn down from the emotional tug-of-war. His logical side urged him to cut ties, to keep Eric far away from the inevitable upheaval. But the part of him that had grown stronger while raising Eric knew that, as painful as the truth might be, his son deserved it. Eric, now 5 years old, sat at the breakfast table, his little hands clutching a crayon as he focused on coloring a picture. His face was scrunched up in concentration, and Paul couldn't help but smile at how serious Eric could be, even with the smallest tasks. Paul had pulled Eric out of school for the day. He knew that the conversation they were about to have needed to take place in a calm, familiar setting. Just the two of them. He hadn't even mentioned it to Charlotte yet. This was something he needed to handle himself. As Paul sat down across from Eric, his heart raced. How do you explain something so complicated to a child? Eric was smart, but this was different. It wasn't a simple bedtime story or a puzzle to solve. This was real, and it had the power to change everything. Hey, kiddo, Paul started, his voice calm but serious. Can we chat for a sec? Eric glanced up from his coloring book, his eyes lighting up when they met Paul's. He grinned, unaware of the gravity of the conversation about to unfold. Sure, Dad. Paul exhaled slowly, folding his hands on the table. There's something important I need to talk to you about. Eric's brows furrowed, not quite sure what this was leading to. What's going on? Paul felt his heart tighten. Remember how we've talked about how families can look different? Some kids have both parents, while others might just have one. Eric nodded, still unsure of what was coming next. "Well," Paul continued, his voice starting to strain a little, "you know how I've always been the one here taking care of you. But before you came to live with me, there was someone else who looked after you." Eric tilted his head, his confusion growing. "Who was it?" Paul paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your mom. Your birth. Mom." The air between them felt thick with tension. Eric stared at Paul, his young face a mix of curiosity and hesitation. He slowly put down his crayon, eyes wide, trying to take it all in. "I have a mom?" Eric whispered, like he couldn't quite believe it. Paul nodded, fighting the lump in his throat. "Yeah, you do. Her name is Linda. She couldn't take care of you when you were born, so she left you with me, and I've been raising you ever since." Eric's gaze searched Paul's face, looking for answers. But why didn't she stay? Paul braced himself, knowing this would be tough. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make really hard choices, Eric. Your mum loved you, but she couldn't give you the care she wanted to, so she let me step in." Eric frowned, his small hands fiddling nervously on the table. "But you're my dad, right?" Paul leaned in, his voice full of love. "I'm always going to be your dad, Eric. That'll never change." Eric's lower lip trembled, and Paul could see the uncertainty clouding his son's eyes. "So, does that mean she's coming back?" Eric's voice was soft, full of uncertainty. Paul paused. "She wants to meet you. Yes, but only if you're ready for that. She's not here to take you away or change anything. She just hopes to be a part of your life when you're ready." Eric stared down at his drawing, his small fingers hovering over the page. "I don't know what to do." Paul reached over, placing his hand gently on Eric's. "You don't have to decide right now, buddy. This is a big deal, and it's okay to be confused. But no matter what, I'll be here. You're not going through this alone." Eric gave a small nod, his face still clouded with doubt. "Will you be there when I meet her?" The question hit Paul hard, his heart tightening. "Yes, Eric, I'll be right there with you, every step." For a moment, the two sat quietly, the weight of the situation lingering between them. Paul could almost see the wheels turning in Eric's mind, trying to process something far too complicated for his age. But beneath the confusion, Paul saw the resilience in his son's eyes, the same strength that had carried Eric through these 5 years with a father still learning how to be one. Eric didn't cry or get upset. Instead, he looked up and asked the one thing that seemed to matter most to him. "Does she love me?" Paul's chest tightened again, his emotions swelling, though he kept his voice steady. "Yes, Eric. She loves you. She cared about you enough to make sure you had a safe and happy life. And she still loves you now." Eric's expression softened, his head nodding slowly. "Okay." Paul exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. It wasn't a solution. There were still many things to figure out, but it was a beginning. Eric, in his quiet, thoughtful way, was showing a resilience Paul hadn't expected. That evening, after Eric had fallen asleep, Paul stood in his son's doorway, watching him in the soft glow of the nightlight. The gentle light filled the room, casting a warm shadow over Eric's bed. His small body was curled up under the covers, clutching the same stuffed bear he had loved since he was a baby. Paul's mind raced. The conversation with Eric had gone as well as it could have, but so many questions still remained. How would Eric feel when he finally met Linda? How would it affect their relationship? The life they had built together? Paul made his way back to his office, where Linda's letter still rested on his desk. He gazed at it, his emotions a chaotic swirl of anger, fear, and something else. something unsettlingly close to hope. Linda wasn't the villain he had thought her to be. She wasn't trying to pull Eric away or disrupt their lives out of selfishness. Perhaps she was just a mother trying to make up for a choice made in a moment of desperation. As much as Paul wanted to shield Eric from any hurt, he realized that keeping the truth hidden wouldn't achieve that. The truth, no matter how painful, was always better than a lie. With a slight tremble in his hands, Paul picked up the phone and dialed. It rang twice before Charlotte's familiar voice answered on the other end. "Paul, is everything all right?" "I need you to set up the meeting," Paul replied, his tone steady but soft. "With Linda. It's time." Charlotte paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was filled with understanding. "I'll take care of it." Paul hung up the phone, leaning back in his chair as doubt continued to cloud his mind. The next step would be the toughest, but it was also the most crucial. Eric deserved to know his full story, and Paul was determined to make sure it happened on his terms as safely as possible. The wheels were already turning, and there was no going back now. No matter what lay ahead, Paul was ready to face it for Eric. The day of the meeting arrived sooner than Paul expected. He had spent the week mentally bracing himself for every possible scenario, but no amount of preparation could truly prepare him for what was coming. The plan was straightforward: a neutral location, a quiet park outside the city where Eric could meet his biological mother without distractions or pressure. But for Paul, it felt anything but simple. As he helped Eric into his jacket that morning, his hands shook slightly. Eric, as always, was full of energy, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm about to unfold. He only knew they were meeting someone special today, someone important. Paul had been careful not to bombard him with too much information. "Where are we going, Dad?" Eric asked curiously as they got into the car. Paul took a deep breath, keeping his tone calm and steady. "We're going to meet someone, buddy. Remember when we talked about your mum?" Eric nodded, his expression serious. "Linda, right?" Paul smiled, feeling proud of how well Eric had understood their earlier talk. "That's right. She's looking forward to seeing you, and I'll be right there with you the whole time." Eric stared out the window, his young mind working through it all. "Is she nice?" Paul's heart tightened at the innocent question. "I believe she is, Eric. But remember, if at any point you don't feel okay, we can leave. It's your choice." Eric nodded, fully trusting his dad, and Paul felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. He had never been more committed to shielding his son from hurt. But he also knew this meeting was a step Eric needed to take. When they arrived, the park was peaceful. The late morning sun filtered through the trees, casting soft light on the ground. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, and the only sounds were distant birds and the crunch of gravel underfoot as they walked down the path. Paul scanned the area carefully. Then he spotted her, Linda, standing by a bench near the lake, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked different from the first time they met. There was a vulnerability to her now, a softness that hadn't been there before, but her eyes were unchanged, filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Eric held Paul's hand tightly as they got closer, his usual curiosity replaced by quiet apprehension. His wide eyes took in Linda as they neared. Linda's breath caught when she saw them. Her eyes locked onto Eric, and Paul could read the emotions flickering across her face. Joy, regret, fear, and love, all swirling together in one powerful moment. She offered them a tentative smile. Paul noticed the slight tremble in her hands as she tried to hold it together. "Hi, Eric," Linda said softly, her voice shaky enough to reveal her nerves. "I'm thrilled to finally meet you." Eric glanced up at Paul, seeking a little confidence, and Paul gave him a reassuring nod. He gave Eric's hand a soft squeeze. "You're doing great, buddy." Eric took a hesitant step forward. His eyes stayed on Linda, observing her intently. He didn't speak right away, just stared with the quiet focus only a child can have. Linda crouched down to his level, keeping a bit of space, but offering him a warm smile. "I've heard so much about you," she said gently, her voice full of affection. "You've turned into such a wonderful boy." Eric frowned a little and glanced back at Paul before looking at Linda again. "Are you really my mom?" Linda's eyes welled up with tears, but she smiled through them. "Yes, Eric, I am. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you when you were younger. But I'm here, now, if you'll have me." Eric's face was a mix of confusion and curiosity. He didn't completely grasp the situation, but he could feel the emotion all around him. He stepped a little closer to Linda, still holding Paul's hand tightly. "Do you like rocket ships?" Eric suddenly asked, breaking the tension. Linda blinked, caught off guard by the question, but her smile grew wider. "I love rocket ships," she answered softly. "Do you?" Eric nodded eagerly, loosening his grip on Paul's hand as he inched closer. "I built one with Legos. Dad says it looks like the one we saw on TV." Linda chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling as she listened. "I'd love to see it one day. Maybe you could show me how to build one too." Paul remained silent behind Eric, watching the moment unfold. It felt almost unreal, seeing his son interact with Linda for the first time. Part of him had been worried this would be hard, that Eric would feel confused or hurt, but instead, it was gentle. Linda wasn't pushing Eric, wasn't overwhelming him. She was letting him take his time. Paul could see how careful she was being. Eric nodded, seeming to relax a bit. "Maybe, but you have to be really careful with the pieces. They're tiny." Linda laughed softly. "I'll be super careful." The conversation moved at a slow pace, with Eric asking little, simple questions. Paul stayed nearby, prepared to step in if Eric seemed uneasy. But much to his surprise, Eric handled the situation better than expected. He was careful but intrigued, slowly testing the waters of this new relationship in his own way. At one point, Eric asked, "Why didn't you come sooner?" His voice was soft, but the weight of the question was heavy. Paul tensed, ready to protect. However, Linda answered with remarkable calmness, "I wasn't ready to care for you the way you deserved, Eric," she said gently, her voice steady, even as tears shimmered in her eyes. "But I thought of you every single day, and I'm so grateful Paul was there for you. He's done an incredible job raising you." Eric considered her words, his brow furrowed as he thought it over. "I like my life with Dad," he said firmly. Paul's heart swelled with emotion, but he kept a neutral expression, letting Eric have his moment. Linda nodded with a bittersweet smile. "I'm happy to hear that, Eric," she replied. "I'm not here to change anything. I just hope I can be part of your life, if you're okay with that." Eric didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked to Paul for reassurance. Paul crouched down to meet Eric's eyes. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said softly. "This is completely up to you, and we'll take it one step at a time, okay?" Eric nodded slowly, then turned back to Linda. "Maybe we can build a rocket ship together one day." Linda's face lit up, gratitude shining in her eyes. "I'd love that, Eric. Whenever you're ready." The conversation continued, with Eric and Linda speaking cautiously but with growing confidence. When it was time to leave, Eric gave Linda a shy wave, and Paul noticed the tears Linda fought hard to keep back. As Paul and Eric walked to the car, the wind gently stirred the leaves around them, and Eric seemed lost in thought, absorbing everything. On the drive home, Eric finally spoke, She's nice. Paul smiled, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. Yeah, she is. Eric stared out the window, his voice softer now. But I still want to stay with you. Paul felt a wave of emotion and gently squeezed Eric's hand. You always will be, Eric. No matter what, you're my son. Eric smiled, and for the first time since their reunion, Paul felt a sense of peace settle within him. This was just the beginning, but they had taken that first step together. Whatever came next, Paul knew they would face it as a family. In the weeks that followed the reunion, life at the Anderson estate fell back into its usual rhythm, but there were subtle shifts that Paul noticed, even if they weren't immediately obvious. Eric didn't rush to see Linda again, and Paul didn't bring it up either. He knew his son needed space to process the reunion on his own terms. Now and then, Eric would ask questions, usually when they were engaged in something simple, like playing with Legos or watching a show together. Do you think Linda misses me? He would ask, or why couldn't she take care of me when I was little? Each time, Paul answered as truthfully as he could, careful not to overwhelm Eric with too much information. He could see Eric's young mind working hard, trying to make sense of his simple, happy life, in contrast to the more complicated world around him. One evening, while Paul was cooking dinner, Eric wandered into the kitchen looking unusually serious. Dad, he said, standing by the counter and fiddling with a toy car, do you think I should see Linda again? Paul paused, setting down the wooden spoon he'd been using to stir the sauce. That's up to you, Eric. Do you want to? Eric bit his lip, thinking. I think so, but can you come with me? I don't want to go alone. A surge of pride and affection filled Paul. Of course I'll go with you, he said softly. We'll do this together, whenever you're ready. Eric's face relaxed a bit. Okay, maybe soon. Paul smiled and nodded. Whenever you're ready, buddy. A few days later, they set up another meeting, this time at a cafe in the city. It felt more relaxed than the first one. With the tension easing after the first meeting, Linda sat by a small table near the window when Paul and Eric arrived. She appeared a bit nervous, but her face lit up when she saw Eric walking in, holding Paul's hand. Hi, Eric, Linda greeted him softly as she stood up to meet them. Hi, Eric replied, his voice still quiet, but showing a little more confidence than before. They all sat down, with Paul staying close, but allowing Eric to take the lead. The conversation started slow, with Linda asking about his school, his favorite toys, and what he liked to do on weekends. Eric answered politely, though Paul could sense he was still feeling things out, trying to figure out who this woman was and what role she might have in his life. At one point, Linda reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo album. I brought something for you, Eric, she said, sliding the album across the table. These are some pictures from when I was younger and from when I had you. Eric's eyes grew wide with surprise. He carefully opened the album, flipping through photos of Linda from years ago, including pictures of her pregnant with him, standing in front of a small, modest apartment. There were baby pictures of Eric, wrapped in a blanket and sleeping soundly. Paul watched as his son grew more intrigued, slowly connecting pieces of his own story. I didn't know you had these, Eric said softly, his voice filled with awe. Linda's eyes shimmered with emotion, but she kept a smile. I've kept them all this time. I wanted you to have them when the moment felt right. Paul observed as Eric studied the photos, becoming more curious. This was a chapter of Eric's life that Paul couldn't provide, a connection to his early years and his biological mother. Even though it stirred something inside Paul, seeing Eric so captivated by this part of his past, he understood how important it was. Eric needed to know his whole story, even if it wasn't always easy. They spent the next hour talking, laughing, and exchanging small memories. Eric's guard slowly came down, And by the end of their visit, he was chatting with Linda more comfortably, just like he did with Paul. Linda was gentle and patient, never pushing Eric beyond what he was ready to share. She seemed happy just to be there, letting Eric set the pace for their conversation. When it was time to go, Eric gave Linda a small hug. It was tentative, but Paul could see how much it meant to Linda, who held back tears as she hugged him softly. As they headed back to the car, Eric seemed lighter, more at peace with the situation. As they crossed the street, Paul held Eric's hand, but there was a new sense of self-assurance in Eric's steps. "Do you think we'll see her again?" Eric asked, glancing up at Paul with hopeful eyes. Paul smiled and nodded. "Absolutely. Anytime you want, buddy." In the months that followed, their lives found a new rhythm. Eric would see Linda from time to time, always with Paul close by. Their connection developed at a slow but steady pace. Paul was surprised by how smoothly they all adjusted. Linda never pushed for more than what Eric was comfortable with, and Paul came to appreciate that about her. He also noticed changes in Eric, once full of questions, anxieties, and nervous energy. Eric had become more grounded, more sure of himself. It amazed Paul how Eric processed his past with a maturity beyond his years. One evening, as they relaxed together in the living room, Eric curled up beside him on the couch, the day's events weighing lightly on them both. "Dad?" Eric asked, his voice sleepy but thoughtful. "Yeah, buddy?" Paul responded, gently running his hand through Eric's hair. "I'm glad I met Linda," Eric said softly. "But I'm also really glad I have you." Paul's heart swelled, emotion flooding through him. "I'm glad I have you too, Eric. More than anything." Eric smiled sleepily, resting his head against Paul's chest. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, Eric," Paul whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As Eric drifted off to sleep, Paul gazed out the window, thinking about how much their world had shifted. He was gradually coming to accept the beautiful, messy reality of being a parent in place of the fear and uncertainty that had previously consumed him. He hadn't expected any of this, but now he couldn't imagine his life without it. The bond between him and Eric had only grown stronger, despite the bumps along the way. And while Linda's role in their lives was still new and a bit complex, Paul realized it wasn't a threat at all. Eric wasn't being taken from him at all. In fact, the boy was growing, finding his place in the world with each step they took together. Paul had experienced growth too, in ways that caught him by surprise. He came to understand that fatherhood wasn't about control or perfection. It was about love, about showing up every single day even when things got tough, and about giving Eric the freedom to figure out who he was, even when that meant sharing him with Linda. Looking down at Eric, now peacefully asleep in his arms, Paul felt a deep calm wash over him. There would always be more hurdles ahead. There always were. But right now, they were doing just fine. More than fine. They were a family, and Paul realized that was his greatest achievement. Years went by, and life at Anderson Mansion settled into a new rhythm. Eric, now 8 years old, had grown into a thoughtful and bright child. His relationship with Linda, his biological mother, had become natural and steady. What began as cautious and infrequent meetings had evolved into regular visits. Linda was now a quiet but steady presence in Eric's world, and Paul had made peace with her role, understanding that it didn't take away from his place as Eric's father. Anderson Enterprises, Paul's business empire, was still thriving, though his approach to work had changed in ways even he hadn't anticipated. He had built his fortune through sheer determination, often putting relationships on the back burner for the sake of success. But now, everything had shifted. Eric was the center of his universe, and balancing work and family had never been more important. Paul still held his own in the boardroom, but his most vital role was always waiting for him at home. It was a late summer afternoon, and Paul sat on his mansion's porch, watching Eric and Linda play in the sprawling garden. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the estate. Eric's laughter filled the air as he kicked a soccer ball across the lawn, and Linda, her movements easy and relaxed, joined in with joy, lighting up her face. Paul leaned back in his chair, sipping on a glass of iced tea, and smiled to himself. He had never expected this, a sense of peace that had found its way into his life. It wasn't part of any grand plan, but it was something he had come to treasure deeply. He had once worried that allowing Linda to be part of Eric's life would somehow damage the strong connection he'd worked so hard to build with his son. But the opposite turned out to be true. Eric had only thrived with both parents in his life, each bringing their unique but complementary influence. As Paul observed them from the porch, Charlotte, his dependable assistant who had since become a close family friend, stepped outside, her face bright with a smile. "You look different, Paul," she teased, crossing her arms as she stood beside him. Paul glanced up, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. "Different how?" he asked. "Happy," Charlotte said with a grin. "Not that you weren't happy before, but there's something else now. You look content." Paul chuckled quietly, taking a slow sip of his tea. "Maybe I am. It took some time to get to this point, but this is exactly where I'm meant to be." Charlotte nodded in agreement, motioning toward Eric and Linda, playing in the yard. "They've really come a long way, haven't they?" "They really have," Paul replied, his voice soft as he watched Eric kick the soccer ball to Linda. "Eric is an amazing kid. And Linda, she's shown more patience and understanding than I ever imagined. I didn't expect things to turn out like this, but I'm so glad they did." Charlotte gave him a knowing look. "You've changed too, Paul. You're not the same person who found Eric on his doorstep all those years ago." Paul leaned back, letting her words sink in. She was right. The man he had once been, focused only on his career and keeping people at arm's length, felt like a distant memory now. Eric had softened him, broken through the barriers he'd built, and in the process had made him not just a better father, but a better man. Someone more present and in tune with what truly mattered. As if on cue, Eric came sprinting toward the porch, out of breath, but glowing with excitement. His face was flushed, and his eyes gleamed with joy. "Dad, did you see that? I kicked the ball so hard," Eric exclaimed, bouncing on his toes, full of boundless energy. Paul smiled, reaching out to tousle his hair. "I saw, buddy. That was an awesome kick." Eric lit up at the compliment, then glanced back at Linda, who was waving him over from the yard. "I'm going to show Linda how to do it." As Eric dashed back to the yard, Charlotte watched him go, then turned her gaze back to Paul with a thoughtful look. "He's really growing up to be an impressive young man. You must be proud." "I am," Paul replied quietly, feeling his chest swell with pride. "I've never been more proud of anything in my life." Over the months, Eric continued to flourish. His bond with both Paul and Linda deepened, with each giving him something special. Paul provided a sense of security, structure, and unwavering support, while Linda brought warmth, creativity, and a connection to his roots. Eric was growing up in an environment filled with love from both parents, and it showed in everything he did. One afternoon, while they were relaxing in the living room, Eric approached Paul with a serious look on his face, clearly thinking about something important. "Dad," Eric said, sitting next to him on the couch. Paul turned to him, curious. "What's on your mind, Eric?" Eric fiddled with the hem of his shirt for a moment before speaking. "I want to spend more time with Linda. Like, Maybe she could come over for dinner sometimes, and I could stay at her place sometimes too. Paul felt a twinge in his chest, but not the fear he once would have had. He nodded, considering Eric's request. "You've been thinking about this for a while, huh?" Eric nodded. "Yeah, I love being here with you, Dad, I really do. But I think I want to be with Linda a bit more too. Is that okay?" Paul smiled warmly and placed a hand on Eric's shoulder. "Of course, Eric. You can see her as much as you want. The most important thing is that you're happy." Eric beamed, clearly relieved. "Thanks, Dad. I love you." Paul pulled him into a tight hug, holding him close. "I love you too, Eric. Always." Over the next few weeks, Linda became even more involved in their lives. Eric started spending the occasional weekend at Linda's apartment, which was slowly becoming a second home for him. Though Paul had been hesitant at first, he felt comfort knowing that Eric was happy. He and Linda communicated openly, making sure Eric always felt secure and loved. At Anderson Enterprises, Paul's business mindset had shifted. He started introducing new policies that reflected his evolving priorities, things like work-life balance, better support for working parents, and creating a more compassionate company culture. Some met these changes with resistance, but Paul stood his ground. He knew firsthand how crucial family was, and he wanted to make sure others had the same opportunity. One evening, as Paul sat in his office going over documents for an upcoming board meeting, he paused. The room, once the core of his world, still mattered, but felt different now. It was no longer the center of his life, just part of a much bigger, richer picture. Eric's laughter echoed down the hallway as he played with Charlotte. Paul smiled, a sense of deep fulfillment washing over him. He had built something far more valuable than his business empire. He had built a family. He put the papers aside, deciding the board meeting could wait. There were more important things to focus on right now. Paul got up and followed the sound of his son's laughter down the hall. As he entered the room, Eric looked up, his face lit with happiness. "Dad, come join us." Paul smiled and sat down on the floor, knowing he was exactly where he needed to be in that moment. As time passed, Paul Anderson realized his greatest success wasn't in the boardroom or the wealth he'd accumulated, but in the family he had created. Eric was at the heart of his world, and with Linda's presence woven into their lives, they had built something truly extraordinary. It wasn't the life Paul had envisioned, but it was the one he had come to cherish, and it was just the beginning. Thanks for watching.